Okie dokie, here we go. So we thought we'd start with a brief history lesson. Before we kick off and talk about this and why this is an important part of the conversation, is that in my research on this topic, there hasn't been a great narrative available and a history lesson that advisors and dealers can use that talk about the journey as to why we are where we are. So this slide, I hope, provides some context and may even be used as a tool to talk to clients and broader interested parties about how we ended up at this point where in 2021, I'll talk about this in a moment, there's an end coming through to grandfather commissions. So to start with, grandfather commissions, the quantity and magnitude of the change can't be underestimated. So it's been estimated by advisor ratings that there is nearly $1 billion of conflicted revenue that advisors are receiving through ongoing trials and the like. The change that we're seeing, which will occur in 2021, will result in $1 billion of revenue, if not treated, being lost to advisors' bottom lines. Now that is significant. That doesn't mean it just goes. It means there's an opportunity for change, and we'll talk about what that means. To talk about conflicted remuneration and what is grandfathered commissions, I thought I'd go back to some of the basics in the research so everyone's on the same page. And the definition that's coming through on grandfathering is to exempt something or someone from a new law or regulation. And that's what has been happening over the last number of years. In the financial advice context, grandfathering concerns ongoing payments from within a super fund or insurance account that's usually paid to a financial advisor. It's also the accounting of these payments are often found in older style legacy products. So we're seeing that this is impacting a number of advisors and investors that have had a long history. We're also seeing that this was exempted through the FOFA legislation some 5 years ago. The grandfather commissions payments are actually paid from the fees or the MER that is coming out of a client's account. The thing to note was that in this history that the actual payment was actually a form of defraying distribution costs. And in some cases, advisors or companies were using this to reward advisors for the ongoing administration and servicing of their clients, which they were not willing to take on. And if we actually start at the far left of this timeline, it's important to give the context around why this started. And there's kind of different lenses that are being applied to this, as in, this is a bad thing and how did we end up here? The reality is, it's more about the journey we've been on and the change in the industry that we're facing now. If I can ask those to step back, I'm sure there's a few people who were around in the early 80s as advisors. If we think about the history, the first thing that we saw was the introduction of managed investment schemes. And they were offered obviously by financial institutions who wanted to start marketing managed investments. And they wanted to obviously make that available so investors could access markets and investments through pooling of their money. The managers in those early days had no sales forces. They didn't have a means to sell the concept. And of course, they didn't have client service organisations. So it was very much the turning of institutional asset management into retail. And most importantly, they had no real way to communicate to investors who ultimately were starting to access their investments. So this was the starting point of trail commissions being paid out of management investment fees. It wasn't an added fee on top, it was actually taken out of the MERs. It was deducted from the investor's account. And it didn't actually look like a specific debit. So there was a key point, which is there was a purpose, which was for supporting advisors to distribute and service managed funds in the early days, but there was not actually discrete disclosure. And it's important to remember back at this stage, investment managers didn't really want relationships directly with investors. And also in those earlier days, the concept of managers being direct to clients was actually pretty well frowned upon by advisors. They wanted to be the intermediaries in that relationship. So we saw in the 80s, late 80s, that there was this environment. In 1990 through to 1998, we really started to see the first signs of vertical integration. And you could see there that the banks recognised the profit opportunities of not only owning asset management, but advice delivery, and ultimately through the introduction of platforms. They could see triple layers of revenue coming through, where they could derive profits from asset management, platform fees, advisor services as well. This period of vertical integration actually created a further opaque nature to the disclosure of fees and the understanding of whether subsidisation or conflicts were occurring. We also saw that during this period there was a mushrooming of the size of the superannuation market, whereby 1992 was of not huge consequence to where it grew to today, being nearly a $2.8 trillion asset pool. So the backdrop of growth and the backdrop of the vertical integration and the changes in who owned what was really what we were dealing with. And it's quite interesting today, we're seeing the unravelling of that now in 2018 as the divestment of major banks from wealth and asset management ownership. During this period of time, there were changes happening, and of course the impost for compliance and legal services were also increasing, and we started to see real cost increases to advisors. And it became apparent that the trailing commissions or the commissions being paid from clients out of products were not enough to fully cost or to cover the cost of operating advice businesses. And this is where we saw the introduction of ongoing advice fees, which was the first sign of more transparent ongoing advice fees. So you had a combination of embedded trailing commission attached also with ongoing advice fees. And you would see the difference there where you'd have a discrete line item on the client statement. At this stage, there was a change going on where we started to see advisors and AFSLs rebate the trails, start to move towards institutional or wholesale offers, so that the advice fees became fully transparent. Now that change wasn't adopted by everyone, and for many cases there were system limitations or product limitations and dealer group limitations. So we are where we are as far as that change. When you think about that journey, we also had the introduction of Bernie, and that I'm talking about in Bernie Fraser. Along came Bernie in 1998, and it was the catalyst for a real battle beginning, and that was where the industry funds had effectively decided to combine the largest 5 industry funds' marketing budgets together to put a super pool together of advertising campaigns that started to talk about and put pressure on the ongoing advice fees that were being charged in retail superannuation in particular. The introduction of the Compare the Pair ads kicked off at that period. It's worth noting we're now in the 3rd generation of these ads, and it is still some of the most significant industry advertising and lobbying that is actually undertaken throughout the industry. In 1998 through to 2013, as a background, we saw a push for reforms coming through, and we saw Labor taking government from 2007 through to 2013, and the introduction of a package of reform measures, which was actually a ban of upfront commissions and trails on new investments. Super funds had to invest in new super contributions into low-cost investments. FDSs were introduced, a whole range of those. And there was also a key date for introduction of 1 July 2013 for many of these measures to come in. And there was different grace periods and implementations that were there. And we heard the first time about the grandfathering of ongoing commissions here. You'd think all was normal, but then of course you have a change of government, and the true grandfathering and in some cases what was described as watering down or rollbacks of some of these changes added to the confusion in the mind of advisors and clients and how this was to be treated. So during this period of change, we acknowledged that that grandfathering existed, and the catalyst for the final change that we're seeing at the moment was at 2019. And we saw that through the introduction of the Royal Commission into Financial Services, chaired by Kenneth Hayne. And one of the key recommendations that came out of that was recommendation 2.4, which was on grandfathered commissions. And that was that it was seen as a high priority recommendation to, as soon as practicable, to change these and to bring into law a change that would see the end of grandfathering and trails. So on the 30th of July, the Coalition Government introduced the legislation, and as we would now see, it is now law. And the legislation that will end grandfathered commissions has actually passed on both sides, or both houses of the federal parliament under the reforms. So we see that Treasury Law's amendment ending grandfathering was actually enacted and introduced and has been passed. The law comes into effect on 2021 practically. There is, however, challenges taking place by various groups in the market. One of those that's been quite vocal around this is the AOIFP, whereby it is assumed a challenge will be mounted to see this changed. The reality of what is happening from not only a law perspective, but the pushback and now what is happening at an industry level is now just starting to take place. So we saw one of the largest groups in Australia through the CFS group announce over the last week or so through one of their spokespeople, confirming the institution does actually plan to phase out grandfathered commissions. They'd made steps with this with their own internal advisory network. But instead of waiting for the January 2021 date, there was a call out that this would be happening sometime before that. So there is a risk now that you'll see institutions who will be required to implement and enact up to this point move this forward. Some of the changes for this is that if you have institutions choosing to move before the January 2020 the January 2021 date, the time horizon for advisors and licensees to react has shortened. So if you were thinking the date that you had was to the January 2021, the industry is tending to now look like it is moving faster than expected.